lectern for a brother. Thanks, Martin. Good morning, everyone. I made this joke in the first service, but I was like, I don't know if he's going to do it again. But you know it's party time when Martin does a glissando on the keys, don't you? Yeah, did it just for me so I can make the gag. Thank you. Hey, everyone. It's so good to be with you. Especially so pleased to have anyone here who's kind of here to celebrate the dedications this morning. I know there's loads of family in the room and friends coming to support. It's always nice to see the parents get like a day off from holding their kid through church when the grandparents are here. So well done. Thank you to all of you. If you don't know me, my name's Chris. I'm part of the leadership team here. And yeah, it's my joy to be speaking on Dedication Sunday. I must admit, when I first got the message to ask if I wanted to do this, my instinctive reaction was basically like, oh, don't you normally like ask grown-ups to like preach on dedication? I don't know, people have like got a family and kind of like got their whole life together, and then I was like, wait a second, I'm in my 30s, I've got a family with 2 children, maybe I'm supposed to be a grown-up, so I'm going to do my best for you this morning. But yeah, I've got 2 kids. I've got a 3-year-old girl and a 1-year-old boy. They're absolutely nuts, but I love them to pieces. I've been married for almost 9 years to my wife B, and thank you, wherever that came from. That's nice, isn't it? And like that family life that I've described is very rooted in Grace Church, actually. Like I met my wife here at church, and we got married in this very room, just down there. And now, like with our 2 kids, we're obviously raising them in and around this church community. And you know, our friends are becoming sort of aunts and uncles to our kids. Like, that's how they talk to them and how they talk about them. And so Grace Church is almost like home away from home for me. It's sort of become my extended family up here in Nottingham. And I hope that in some way or form, like you feel a version of the kind of Grace Church family today on this very special Family Sunday for all of us. Family is important to us as a church. It's at the heart of who we are. You'll hear us talk about family a lot. And I love Sundays like this in particular because it really does put it front and center, literally. And you have all the parents with their little kids. And as I said, family and friends come to support, friends in the church as well that then get to cheer on. And yet one of my favorite things, I think, actually about Dedication Sunday is the way in which, yes, there's all those people that know the parents and families up on stage. But I love how also you have people in the church who maybe you don't have relationship personally with these mums and dads, and yet you are still championing them. You're still cheering them on. You're praying for them and encouraging them. I think that's a really special thing. I think that's actually quite profound, and perhaps something that's harder to come by in this day and age where we often kind of keep ourselves to ourselves. Family is obviously something that we all have experience of, one way or another, kind of for better or worse, like good and bad experiences. And I think it's also true to say that there are seemingly some sort of universal truths about particular family dynamics. We didn't ask this question because it would have been very unfair on all the parents, but which baby do you think is the cutest? Most parents would say their own. If not, I'd have some questions. But that's usually true. Parents think that their kids are the cute ones. Then they grow up and you're like, oh, actually, you kind of funny as a baby. But another thing that seems to be universally true amongst family life is like sibling rivalry. Quick show of hands. Who grew up with a kind of competitive relationship with a sibling? Yeah. I was one of 3, still am. So I've got an older sister and a brother who's 4 years younger than me. And growing up, me and my brother would compete at anything that we could make into a competition. And I was best man for my brother about a month ago. And in my speech at the wedding, shared a little bit about our competitive relationship. And because I was older than him, I was better at him than everything for like quite a long time, just by virtue of age and strength. But I will never forget, and I said this in my speech, the day that like that all came crumbling down, like my dynasty and my reign. We had some like random race on a beach, and I was so sure I was going to win. And he absolutely thrashed me, and soul-crushing, frankly, and something you never truly recover from, and I've forever been the slow brother, But at that wedding, loads of people came up to me afterwards and were like, oh, my boys are the same, or I was like that with my sibling. Like, it just seems to be that that's often the case. So there are some aspects of family that are all universally true, always the case. We're going to look at a story in the Bible today that I think perhaps is a little bit surprising in the family dynamic that it depicts. It's a story of the prodigal son, which will be familiar to lots of us. There's his father with 2 sons, and the story is about how he responds to each of them and in their sort of journeys of life. And even if we don't know the specifics of the story, maybe you're new to church and you're like, I don't really know it, but well, it's in culture enough that the instance of like, oh, the prodigal has returned, well, this is where it comes from. It comes from this story of this prodigal son that goes away and comes back. And the amazing thing about this story, and as we read it in a minute, is that the father in this story, it shows us what God is like. It paints this incredible picture of our Father in heaven, shows us how he responds to us. So as we go through it, just watch that is laced with meaning about who God is, like it tells us about him. It's not the most helpful title, though, the parable of the prodigal son, because, yeah, there is a prodigal son, but there are two sons, actually. We don't have time to get into both today. I would say generally the younger son is the famous one, but there's an older son, and there's as much to learn from his response at the end of the story as there is the younger son and the interaction with the father. It's just worth knowing that, and I will make a couple of comments on the older son as we go through. And for us to truly grasp this story, this parable, we have to kind of feel the emotion of it. We have to really get into it. The problem is, as I've said, lots of us know it already. And as is often the case with kind of anything in life, like the more familiar you become with something, there tends to be that its power sort of lessens. You go to the cinema, go see a film. The first time you see it, it grips you and stirs you and has you on the edge of your seat in a way that diminishes on the third, fourth, fifth viewing at home on Netflix, doesn't it? That is, it would seem, apart from Paddington 2, which I don't know if you've seen it, but there's this bit at the end where Aunt Lucy comes home and she's at the door. I don't know how many times you've watched that film. Every time it will just knock you for six. If you haven't seen it and that was a spoiler, then I don't know what you've been doing with your life, not watching Paddington 2. But most of the time, it would seem that these things lessen over time. And so, well, what do you do with a story like this where you know it and it's familiar? Well, the good news is that the Bible is alive and breathing. And so as we read it, God can speak to us in a fresh way, even if you've read this 1,000 times. And that's what I'm believing for today, as we look into it, that God will do something new and stir our hearts afresh. So let's read the story itself. We're going to be in Luke chapter 15, and we're going to pick up in verse 11. We'll sort of do the first chunk up to verse 20, and then we'll look at the Father's response after that. So have it open in your Bibles if you've got one. Otherwise, the words should be on the screens. You can follow along up there. So Luke 15 from verse 11. Jesus says this. There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me." And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he'd spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father and will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father." We'll pause there and we'll pick it up a little bit later. So you have this father with 2 sons. He's clearly a man of some wealth by virtue of the property and the land that he has. And the younger of his 2 boys comes to him with this request. He wants his inheritance now. Like that which would naturally come to him where the father passes away. He's like, "No, I want it. I want it now." And it's hard to convey, and even the story doesn't quite kind of grasp it this way, just how insulting, how humiliating, how heartbreaking a request this would be to the dad. Because the boy is, in essence, wishing him dead. But I don't care about you. You are a means to an end. I just want what's coming to me, and you can be out of the picture. It's pretty ruthless, isn't it? To say this to your dad. And there's a lot in this story that is implied, left up to our imaginations, I think deliberately so by Jesus. And I just have to wonder, like, what would the father have been feeling as he divided up his property? Because that's what he does. He doesn't fight it. He doesn't try and control his son. He just does what he asks. He divides up his property. And as would have been tradition at the time, you'd give double to the firstborn son. So in this scenario, the older son would have got 2/3 of everything that the dad had, and the younger son would have had 1/3. And because we know the nature of the story, that the younger son is the one that goes off with this wealth, the younger son would have been given like the physical stuff, like the capital, the cash almost, as it were, whereas the older son would have been given the 2/3 would have been the real estate, the property itself, as he stayed and remained behind. And then we're told, after he gets all of this wealth, divided up by his father, that he journeys to a far-off country, where famously, and this is kind of the crux of the story that we know it to be, he spends it with abandon. He squanders everything he has. He wastes it all over a number of years. And then interestingly, we're told that when he'd spent everything, every last penny, every ounce of the wealth that he was given by his father, that a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. Terrible timing. Like, of all the moments, he has all this wealth for years that has been spending freely and frivolously and enjoying life, and not a week earlier, not a day earlier, but the moment that he ran out of money. Even 24 hours earlier, maybe they had just enough to make it by and figure something out. No. When he'd spent everything, this famine hits. And a famine doesn't just hit the region or the area, that part of the world where, you'd be like, well, it doesn't matter where he'd have gone, he still would have come up against this scenario. No, we're told that severe famine hit that country, the very specific country that he chose to go to spend his wealth. Not anywhere else, just that country. That's a rough ride. He's had a bad time there, hasn't he? It could have been anywhere else in the world, but no, the country that he chose, after he'd spent everything he had, famine hits. And he's desperate. Maybe you've had moments like that in your life where you've gone all in on something. Maybe you've even moved, you've invested heavily in something, only for the circumstances just to conspire against you in some sort of brutal, cruel, perfect storm. Like one of those days where everything just seems to go wrong. That's what's happening to this guy. And such is his desperation at this point. He literally has nothing left to work with. He hires himself out to someone who lives in the land to feed his pigs. And we have to understand how this role, like this job, would have been unimaginable to him, even just days earlier. Pigs would have been seen as ceremonially unclean. The Jewish people would have had nothing to do with them. Don't go near them, don't touch them, don't consider them. And yet here he is, he's like, what else have I got? So he goes in, feeding the pigs. After chasing all the material highs of the world has chewed him up and spat him out. It's all come crumbling down. And to some extent, I wonder if we've all felt something like this, of like the younger son experience here. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of us have lived reckless lives quite like this, though maybe you have. Maybe that is part of your story. But I think we've all chased things, haven't we? We've all gone after stuff before. And often it's not even sinister things, it's just the pleasures of life, like things in the world that we enjoy, things that we love, but then things that become too loved, that they start taking a wrongful priority in our lives. They become the thing. And they always disappoint us. One way or another, eventually, those things don't fulfill in the way that we dreamed and hoped. They crumble, often underneath the weight of our own misdirected expectation. Like we are the ones that usually put so much into that, say this is going to be the thing. The reason why it hurts so much at the end is because that's where it started. And this is a slightly trivial example, but it kind of brings it to life, I think, a little bit. I was watching the show on BBC, Race Across the World. Anyone seen that? Yeah, it's great. The premise of the program is basically you have these like 5 or 6 pairs of people, and they have to do a race literally kind of across the globe in all these random weird places. And the only rules are you can't get a plane, and you don't have your smartphone. So you get given like a map, your passports, and whatever you want on your back, and off you go. Buses, taxis, hitchhiking, all that kind of thing. And in the latest series, the one that's on at the moment, we're watching it this week, and there's this young guy who kind of, in one of the interviews, tells his story of how growing up he was into cricket, and he was good at it as well. Very good, in fact. That he was in the Yorkshire team, on the brink of kind of first team, and maybe even like England was on the horizon. And then one day, he says in this interview, he gets a call from the powers that be at the club, and they're like, "We don't think you're good enough, you're done." And that was it. This thing, his whole life, his whole world, this thing, it invested everything, his time, money, energy into. Presumably his parents had done the same, and all of a sudden, nothing. He admitted that's kind of part of the reason why he was doing this show, was like, I need to like find myself, like who am I now after this has all fallen apart? I think that's kind of what we're looking at here. I think we've all probably experienced something of that, maybe to differing extents, but it's a familiar feeling. And often in these scenarios, like when the cold, hard facts of the situation hit us, we do come to our senses or start asking questions of what's gone on. That's what happens here with the younger son. He has this epiphany moment. He's like, "What are you doing? Even the servants back home are being fed and are not going hungry, and yet here I am in with the pigs, starving. Like, what have I done? Like, what am I doing with my life?" And it's in that moment that he makes a decision to go back home. And we kind of read that he starts rehearsing what he's going to say to his dad, going over his speech. I don't know if you've ever done that. You're going to have an interaction with someone, you kind of go over what you're going to say. For me, it's often like phone calls. Us millennials, we hate phone calls. Avoid them like the plague. So if ever I'm having to make one, you're darn right I'm going to go into a small room and practice like, "Oh, hello, it's Chris here," like 100 times over, as if I don't know. It's just funny, like if ever I have to make an inquiry of something or a service or whatever, go to the website, like, "Oh, there's a phone number," so I could ring them and probably get the answer I need here and now with a pleasant conversation for a few minutes. "Oh, but there's a web contact form that I could fill in and have to wait 3-4 days for a reply." Now we're talking. So yeah, I'll rehearse my phone calls. I'm unashamed to say that. I put my phone voice on. If you're like, "Oh, I don't have a phone voice," I'm sorry to tell you, you do. No one's just ever pointed it out to you before. But essentially that's what the son starts to do, is like he starts going over his words, practicing what he's going to go say to his father, how to grovel, how to beg to be let home. And he knows in what he's asking, I'm not going to go back to what I once was. That's not even the request he's going to make. He's like, not to be a son, just to be a servant, to be bottom of the pile, but just to get back in the house. You can imagine all the way home, this long journey. He's rehearsing it. He knows he's burnt that bridge to the ground. And then we look at what happens next. So let's pick up our story again in verse 20. So Luke 15, verse 20. So he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Oh, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead. He's alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. If we didn't know the story, you wouldn't have guessed that this is what was coming to the younger son. The father's response here is staggering. Let's just see what happens. He saw him. That's the first thing we're told. While he was still far off. It implies he's been looking. Maybe even scanning the horizon every day for years. Maybe this is the day that my son will come home. And there he spots a glimpse. He starts to recognize the face. He's coming. And the moment that he sees him, what does he feel in his heart? Compassion. And he runs. He runs to him. And we have to note the location of the encounter between the father and the son here. Because he doesn't wait for the son to come to him. He doesn't wait for the son to get home. No, he drops everything and runs to his boy. He meets him on the road. Now, we can piece together from what we do know in the story, some of these details, that they're grown-up children, these sons. It's been years since the youngest son had left, so the father is probably a slightly older man. And he's obviously of a certain standing and wealth that it would have meant it was well beneath him to be seen running in public, like socially unaccepted behavior. And yet, at the first glimpse of his son's return, he kicks off his sandals, lifts up his robes, and runs hard to his boy. Not with anger or resentment in his heart, but with compassion. And when he gets there, he embraces him. He kisses him. And the word embrace there in the Bible, the most literal translation of it is he fell on his neck. Like he literally throws himself at his son, kisses him, presume like almost to the ground. He's so delighted that his son has returned. And it's worth us considering here the social cost of a moment like this for the father, where who knows what people would have been saying, maybe for years, of how the son left, the manner in which he left, how long he's been gone, will he ever come back? Maybe even people seeing, oh, he is returning. I wonder what's going to happen. And I saw an instance of this. It almost happened like in real life recently on the news. And putting politics aside for a moment, it's the story of Hunter Biden, the son of current sitting president of the US, Joe Biden. He was just found guilty on 3 charges of lying about drug use when he was purchasing a gun back in 2018. Was convicted on all counts. Imagine like the collateral damage that would do to his dad. It's the first time ever that the son of a sitting president has been convicted of a felony. And yet there was this moment in the report that tells us that Joe Biden left wherever he was and whatever he was doing to go and meet his son on the tarmac at an airport. And what does he do when he gets there? He just hugs him. He hugs Hunter Biden's wife and their little boy. And I've got to believe that Joe Biden's advisors would have been warning against what might happen. If you go, you need to know this will be used against you. Like something like this, you know for sure it's going to come up in the presidential debates, and lo and behold, it did. You've got to know that this will do great damage to your credibility. Ultimately, something like this could cost him the presidency. And yet, no cares for all of those things, and instead goes to meet his son and embraces him. It's a profound interaction, and it gets at something of what's going on here. And at that point, the younger son starts to give his long-rehearsed speech. But he doesn't even get to finish. Because the father cuts across and commands the servants to get the best robe, a ring, shoes for his tired feet, to go and kill the fattened calf, which would have been reserved for only the highest celebrations and occasions, to celebrate, to throw a feast for his son has come home. I love what the writer Peter Williams says in his book, The Surprising Genius of Jesus. He says, there is literally no need for the father to say anything to the younger son. Speech such as, welcome or I love you, isn't necessary, since the father's actions, his run, his embrace, his kiss, have spoken clearly. The father has no thought of reprimand or even of asking questions. He doesn't even ask him where he's been or what he's done. He has a one-track mind set on celebration because his son has come home. His son was dead and is now alive, was lost and is now found. The father's response in this story is beyond belief. There is nothing in the son that warrants and deserves this response from his father, but more importantly, there is absolutely nothing that will stop the father's love from reaching his son. And it's here in this moment that this kind of abstract story comes crashing into our hearts when we realize that we have a father who loves us the same way. Like, this is our story. For all of us have been the younger son. Humanity, in fact, at large. It's written into our DNA almost. In the very beginning, in the Garden of Eden, we took what we thought was rightfully ours at the wrong time. You can't control us, God. We don't need you. We're going to go our own way. And so we did. Like mankind set off, left home, as it were, to chase material highs, to find fulfillment in literally anything else that we could get our hands on, to indulge ourselves, make a name for ourselves. And our hearts have been riddled with sin, this turning away from God ever since. But for those of us who know Jesus, this is our story. This is how the Father responded. When we had left home, we spent all that we could. We came to the end of ourselves and were asking, like, what am I doing? What is this life? At the first sign of our turning, the first glimpse on the horizon, in our repentance to come home, God came running to meet us on the road. He didn't wait for us to get there. He didn't wait for you to explain yourself. He didn't ask you any questions about why or what's gone on before, or what you're going to do for him after. He gave everything to meet you where you were. And in the same way that the Father's actions in this story spoke louder than words ever could, so too the actions of God the Father have reverberated throughout history. He sent his own Son, in fact, Jesus Christ, to come and die, to make sons and daughters of you and me, so that we could be welcomed home. And in arms flung wide on the cross as Jesus was crucified, there we find the embrace of God. For anyone who would turn and put their trust in him. This is our story, that we have known the unreserved, unashamed embrace of God, known his loving kiss, been marked and clothed in his righteousness, truly the very best robe. The whole of heaven celebrates with him. For each of us was lost. Now we're found. Each of us was dead in our sin, now alive in Christ forevermore. We have become sons and daughters of the Most High God. We have been welcomed home. This parable is our whole story. It gives us such cause for celebration, doesn't it? But it also gives us hope right now, in the today and our tomorrow. Because if you know Jesus, it gives you hope in your ongoing journey of repentance, because you know full well that that's going to happen. There might be, our initial stories, we left home and we returned, but almost like we're forever kind of leaving home for little bursts here and there. As we try and go our own way, as we make foolish decisions to chase other things, to slightly reject the way of life that God invites us into, only to come to our senses time and time again and think, I wonder how he's going to receive me this time. That's how. Every single time. No questions, just joy. Just delight that you've turned again. It also offers hope to anyone for whom maybe this story feels a little bit more real and raw, because, today we've celebrated the smallest of children in our church family, the beginnings of their journeys. Maybe you've raised your children in the things of the Lord, and yet they've wandered away from God. And you're thinking, when will they ever come home? Now look, I can't stand up here and tell you what's going to happen. I can't tell you whether they will or not. But what I do know is that this is how God will come to them. There is always a way back in him. There is always a way home. And there is no one who has wandered too far to come home. And perhaps that's where we'll kind of land things for today. With the offer, this invitation to come home. It's been such a joy to celebrate on this family occasion for us as a church with parents and little ones, but maybe you're here in the celebration, in amongst the crowd, yourself feeling a little bit lost. And that's actually what the older brother's a bit like. So the celebration starts at the younger son's return. As if we were to read on, the older brother resents the celebration. He stays outside of it because he's kind of grown cold in his heart. But no, there's a chance for all of us today to return and come home. Maybe you used to know God, but you feel like you've wandered. And maybe you're even a little bit embarrassed or kind of ashamed at what's gone on and how it's happened. And you think, I don't know if I can come back. You can today. Maybe you've never known God. Perhaps you're brand new to church today, or you've been exploring it a little bit more recently yourself. You think, I've come to the end of myself. I've tried 101 things, and yet something in me still feels empty. Where can I go? You can go to the Father. And maybe just quickly on that older son, I wonder if there's some people in the room who you've not left, as it were. You don't feel like you've wandered too far. You've stayed, and like the older son, you've kind of cracked on with like life and church stuff, and you've kind of been doing all the stuff, and yet somehow like the fire's gone out. And in its place has kind of grown a little bit of like just bitterness towards God, a bit of resentment to what's going on around you. This coldness in your heart. You're like, I'm not in on it anymore. Well, there's an invitation for you today. There's a cliffhanger at the end of this story. We never know if the older son comes into the celebration or not. But we know that you can. Let me tell you today, whichever of those describes you, you can know this hope for yourself. You have a chance to come home. And I promise it's with no questions asked. You don't need to explain yourself to any of us, anyone else in this room, certainly not to God himself. The Father wants to embrace you. No matter how far you feel you've gone, at the first signing of your turning, he will run and run hard to meet you right in your seat this morning.